Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at a nonfiction book called And the Band Played On: Politics, People, and the AIDS Epidemic by Randy Shilts. So this is, again, a nonfiction book about the early ages of the AIDS epidemic. So a thing about Randy Shilts, one, this book came out in 1987, so the science is what was believed at the time. So we know a lot more now. There's treatments now. AIDS is not a death sentence. At this time, we knew very, very little about AIDS. It was most certainly a death sentence. And it was still believed that it came to this country through gay men. So that is very much the belief. Mind you, it was actually known that it came from Africa. They still assumed that it came from Africa through Europe, through gay men. Now, reality is what we know now, and this is pretty recent when we've studied the genome, I believe, the AIDS virus does come from Africa. It came through the United States through Haiti and through Haitian immigrants. That's how it got here. And then it got into the blood supply through IV drug use, various sexual things, and giving of blood. Because again, we know now that AIDS is in the blood. And for the longest time, they don't want to believe it. So this book starts off in Africa with a Dutch doctor, actually two Dutch doctors. One is dying of what we now know as AIDS. She picked it up through what we can probably guess is an unclean environment. She was dealing with blood products. She was dealing with limited resources and all sorts of things. So she'd been sick for 2 years, various exhaustions, colds, swollen lymph nodes. Eventually she goes back to the Netherlands and dies from an opportunist infection. And her friend, another Dutch doctor, becomes obsessed, and he starts working in France, and they start seeing people, particularly from Africa, who have spent time in Africa, who are coming up with these opportunistic infections and dying. And so particularly the Pasteur Institute starts studying this. Now, back to the United States, he does this whole recounting of the bicentennial celebrations in 1976. And the reason he does this is because when Shilts asked his friends, when was the last time you knew, everybody you knew was well and not sick? And it was 1976. So he uses that almost as a starting point when he's talking about what's going on in the United States. So in San Francisco and New York, these gay men start showing up specifically with a type of skin cancer that is normally found in old Italian men who end up dying of something else. So it's not a fatal skin cancer. And yet these men are dying of it. And it's running rampant. And eventually it's figured out that they don't have immune systems. So they assume it's some sort of either biological agent or it's cancer. So it ends up at the National Cancer Institute, which is part of the National Institute of Health. And they're trying to figure out what's going on. The CDC is trying to figure out what's going on. They're butting heads. There are doctors in both New York, San Francisco, and LA who are trying to figure out what this is. That's where it focuses. I know eventually it pops up in the Haitian population in Miami. Again, this is where it started, but they didn't know that now. It was popping up in the IV drug users, particularly in New York and San Francisco. And then some doctor actually caught it off pretty early in babies that were being born to IV drug using women. But nobody was listening to that. Nobody was really listening to the IV drug users, let alone the Haitians. It was assumed that these people were closeted gays. So it was very quickly branded, this is a gay disease. The thing that happens going around in 1981 is when these things start popping up. The thing that happened here is this is the start of the Reagan administration. Ultra-right Christians likes to cut things to lower taxes, particularly in the Department of Health. So yeah, the budgets of the CDC and the National Institute of Health and any sort of grants coming from the government for, studying science, let alone ones that are killing gay people because, ultra right-wing Christians want gay people dead, And they don't care and couldn't care less about either Haitian immigrants or IV drug users, let alone their babies, because it's their fault, because they're undesirables, therefore they can die. So we're not going to spend money on them. Yeah, that was a thing. So you're dealing with the backdrop of the fact that the Reagan administration is homophobic, racist, and cutting things like crazy, so there's no money. So that's the other thing. And then you have the butting heads of doctors. The guy who was finding in babies, nobody was listening. Nobody would publish his paper. Nobody was, it's like, this cannot be babies. It's a gay disease. It's just a gay disease. They wouldn't listen for the longest time. I don't think they even remotely started listening until 1983. So, and then of course it didn't really explode until 85. But early on in this, it was in the blood supply and they knew it. It was also popping up in hemophiliacs and people who were having blood transfusions, but it was such a small amount at that time that the blood banks didn't want to listen. They didn't care. I mean, so what? They didn't want to lose gay men who were donating blood. They didn't want to spend the money to test the blood. They were not going to spend, basically, it was a waste of their time and they didn't want to listen for the longest time. So I don't think they actually started testing bloods until 1985, until they actually did something. Yeah. The other thing you see besides the politicking going on in the medical field, because the National Institute of Health was fighting with the CDC, the FDA was fighting with the CDC because they thought the CDC was overstepping. Once it was realized it was a infectious disease, the National Cancer Institute didn't want to let it go and transfer it over to the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, because God forbid they actually, turn over research to the department that actually should be covering this. But no, we're going to argue and complain and be arrogant. And oh, the egos. This book is full of lots and lots of egos. Lots and lots of male egos running rampant everywhere. And arrogance and politics. It was very, very messy. And all those male egos. The other thing was going on besides that politic fighting is you had actual politics going on in DC, where you see some of the fighting for these two specific gay aides who are, they're senators' aides. They're trying to get funding for research because there's no funding for research. Doctors are begging for funding for research. They are moving in basically the CDC, the National Cancer Institute. They're transferring money from other projects to work on this, and it's never enough. They don't have the money. So these guys are fighting for more money for research. And of course, this is the Reagan administration. Gay people, money. Two things these people hate: giving money and gay people. So that wasn't coming around anyway, because again, they didn't care. And they still didn't believe that it was in the blood supply. And then you also have these, specifically, he focuses on two doctors, one at UCLA, I believe, and the other at UC San Francisco, who, because they couldn't get funding, went around their universities to the legislature to get funding. And they didn't play the game of the university, and the universities looked down on them because they weren't doing actual research, because they were trying to save people's lives, and how dare they? And they weren't playing the game, and they weren't kissing up, and they weren't, I think both of them were relatively young, and God forbid they try to save people's lives. So they actually ended up, at the end of the book, they're losing their careers. They had to go into private practice and leave the university system because they were ostracized. So, and that's happened to a lot of people throughout this for daring to want to save people's lives. The other person this happened to was somebody who worked for the CDC by the name of, why on earth can I now not forget his name? I want to say it's Donald Woods, but that's another person. That's also another book. Let me pull this up here. Where was it? Why on earth can I not? It was Donald something. So we're just going to move on. And Donald Francis, there we go. Don't want to waste too much time looking on this. He was a doctor who was, why we don't know him is amazing. He was part of getting rid of smallpox. He was also a big part of eliminating and finding the testing for and treatment by vaccine for hepatitis B, which is not something we think about anymore all that much, because there was this vaccine for it, and most people, particularly my generation, who were born right around the time the start of the AIDS epidemic, ended up being vaccinated for it. And now babies are, I mean, my daughter's had all 3 of her Hep B vaccines, and she's 2. So you don't think about it anymore. He was working in Phoenix until, I believe, 83 on this, trying to figure this out. Again, primitive conditions and nobody's listening. And he lost his career because after he went to the CDC, he was pissing people off because he was asking for money. And how dare he ask for money to save people's lives, to end an epidemic? And he wasn't shy about saying that we could stop this. If we had the money, we could stop this. So he pretty much lost his career. At the end of the book, it states that, one, he won't get published and nobody's paying attention to him anymore. He's leaving the CD. He gets a transfer to San Francisco, which some people say he's being punished. Some people say that was his choice. Most likely it was his choice. He was sick of being in Atlanta. And again, I believe he was from San Francisco anyway, because he knew a lot of people in San Francisco. So he actually went there, and though at the end of the book it was assumed by Shilts that he was going to go back to Africa, because he was also a big part of the Ebola epidemics. But I've since done basically what he ended up doing is he left the CDC in the early 90s, and then he was trying to work on what they thought was their best hope back then, was a vaccine, which of course has never materialized. We have treatments for AIDS. They can control it now, but the vaccine has been very much proved elusive. But that's what Donald Francis ended up doing. But he lost his career in the CDC because he was making noise and wanting money and not hiding things. So that was very, very common among these doctors who were fighting for things, because nobody wanted to listen. And so a lot of times they ended up being ostracized, even once they found out that these guys were right, because how dare they? How dare they want to save lives and not focus on the politics? The other thing that you see in this book that's really sad is how the gay community was torn apart by this. Rather than uniting them to fight a disease that was killing them, it tore them apart, because you had 2 sides. You had on one side these big businesses, these bathhouses, the part of the gay liberation, where these men were able to freely go have sex with those unprotected sex with as many men as they want. All of a sudden they were sexually liberated. They were free to be themselves, and they didn't want to give that up, and they didn't want to admit that something was killing them. And that having a bunch of unprotected sex with random men is going to have you die a slow, miserable, often painful death. And then you have the side who are saying, this is not who we are. We don't have to. We can be monogamous. We can be in relationships. We can have safe sex. We don't have to have this huge gay liberation of unprotected sex and orgies and things like that. And these people were called homophobic and anti-gay, and there was so much hatred going on. And then there were people, particularly in New York, there was one man who ended up was a playwright, who was kicked out of the organization he helped start because he wanted to be more militant. He wanted to make more noise. And he was right, because New York ended up doing nothing. They had no resources. They had no services. Gay people were dropping like flies, and nobody wanted to touch them. And did find out once people, they'd like, oh, there's a disease in gay men. Let's not treat them. Because the hospitals, they were terrified. They didn't know how this was spread. There were so many unknowns, and they were just afraid. And that's the other thing that popped up when it did eventually pop up in the news, because the news was relatively silent. And that was the other big thing that Shilts points out. The heterosexual news, the big news agencies, weren't paying attention to this because it didn't matter to them. It wasn't happening to their people. So it didn't matter. So it popped up a little bit, but mostly it was fear-mongering. Once it got out, it was the religious people saying it's their fault because they're gay men, and it's only in gay men. It wasn't. Or the IV drug users who, for a while, people said, like, no, they're lying. They are actually having sex with men. No, they're just IV drug users, and it's in the blood. But, again, it was very much of a fight of the unknown for many, many years, and this book shows this quite clearly. It's very, very sad. And distressing to think that all these egos were going on. The other major ego is a man by the name of Robert Gallo. Gallo was a cancer expert at the National Cancer Institute who was looking for a Nobel Prize, was known to find this HLV virus. I think that's what it was. And that's what they called it throughout this. He called it HLV3, which we now know is a completely different virus. But he had some issues with the Pasteur Institute, which was in France, who actually discovered the virus, and they realized this is a brand new virus, and there was some back and forth on the French published their paper in 83. Gallo didn't publish his paper in 84, calling it this is his virus. There was lawsuits, and there was arguments over several years. Gallo did find the connection between what we now know as the HIV virus and AIDS, but he did not discover the HIV virus. So you see those egos going around. So, and that's really what this focuses on. It focuses on a lot of this infighting, the begging for money, the careers that were destroyed for people just trying to stop this epidemic. And of course, they never do. And then one of the big things and you go through this, one of the major characters is a San Francisco woman with their health institute called Selma Dritz. And she, early on, gets this board, a little whiteboard, and she's the one who has, basically, Shilts had talked to her, mentions the butcher's bill, where apparently during the Napoleonic Wars, one of the generals would ask at the end of the day, what was the butcher's bill for today? How many people were sick and dying? And she had this count. And yes, the book, throughout various chapters, when certain events happen, it recounts how many people are sick and how many people are dead from the disease throughout these years. Now, the major climax in this book is 1985. And what happens in 1985 is a well-known heartthrob and actor by the name of Rock Hudson, who's closeted gay, though it's apparently a well-known secret in Hollywood that he was gay, collapses in a Paris hotel. And he's taken to the hospital to be treated by a doctor who's known to be treating AIDS patients. And he admits that he has AIDS. And so that's when it explodes. All of a sudden, oh, he's a gay guy, but this movie star has AIDS. And they actually, Shilts goes to another man who'd been working on it for years, who eventually went on vacation to Hawaii because he was sick of fighting. He was sick of fighting so many people. And he sees this on the news. It's like, why? All of a sudden it matters that this movie star has AIDS, and it doesn't matter when he had dozens of friends who had already died of this, and were dying of this. And it's like, all of a sudden now people care. And that's very much when it explodes. That's when they finally fully force people to realize this is in the blood supply. That's when the blood banks, who had been massively stonewalling and not wanting to admit that it's in the blood supply, they were forced to act. There was one San Francisco hospital in all of this until 1985 that was testing their blood and throwing out blood. But nobody else was. And it was in the blood supply, and it was killing people. And it wasn't until 1985 that they finally essentially stopped gay men from giving blood and started testing the blood. And by then, it had already gone through people. Anybody who had any sort of blood transfusion, from hemophiliacs to people having surgery, it was in the blood supply. And they knew, I think they had proved it pretty much by 1983. And the CDC, specifically Don Francis, yelled at them. He asked them, and I think, yeah, he yelled quite a bit. This was part of what damaged his career. How many people have to die for you to do something? Turned out it was thousands. Thousands of people had to die for them to actually bloody damn do something. So that is kind of the major climax, and then it kind of goes into how all of a sudden the money started rolling in, how it started getting into the big news stations. This is when people start talking about AIDS. In 1985, when the doctors had been messing with this since 81. So it took until Rock Hudson. That's what a lot of people, Shilts talks about. It's like there was before Rock Hudson and after Rock Hudson. So it's very, very sad that it took some massive movie star having this disease for people to wake up and pay attention. And then, of course, there was also some lawsuits going on. There was a woman, an older grandmother, wealthy family, who I believe she had some sort of surgery. I think it might have been hip surgery. And she ended up having AIDS. The daughter, she starts getting these opportunistic infections, and the granddaughter starts seeing it, and she starts researching it. And she's like, my grandmother has AIDS, and nobody's admitting it. She's looking this up. It's like she's getting these things that are typical in AIDS patients. And they end up filing a lawsuit against the blood banks. Against the blood bank, because she finds out that they knew back in 1983. So, and it's on record. So they ended up dealing with lawsuits because it was realized that they knew, and they didn't do anything, and they were giving AIDS to people. And they didn't care. The same with the bathhouses. The bathhouses started, particularly in San Francisco, started being shut down in 1985 because the governments, particularly in San Francisco and New York, were being forced to wake up and pay attention. They were being guilted, and these things are killing people. You got to shut them down. They finally had the media pressure to have backbones and fight essentially the gay community to save their lives and shut things down. So all of this happened basically, it was very much a build up of fighting until 1985, and then all of a sudden you have a bunch of funding. But you also have people like Don Francis and some of these San Francisco and California doctors who lose their careers because they were trying to fight it for so long, and even though they were right, they made noise, they went around systems to get money to save lives, and politics. Politics is more important than saving lives, and that's what this book really does show, and it's very, very sad. So this book is really, really, like what this book is really good. As a dyslexic, I found it an extremely engaging read. It's a very, very sad and frustrating read, particularly this is being filmed in the end of August of 2021. So the COVID-19 pandemic is revving up again. So we're just getting to a point where the FDA tomorrow, because this is being filmed on the 22nd, is going to take one of the COVID vaccines and make it official. It's no longer going to be experimental. So hopefully the numbers will go back down again. But again, this book specifically is hard to read. It makes you realize how much politics is in our healthcare system, and how doctors can be ignored and ostracized, and just nobody pays attention to it when they're trying to save lives. So that's what's scary about this. It makes you real. And yes, this is probably still going on. Please be aware that there are still quite a few people in Congress who were around, including our current president. Biden would have been a senator at the time. He may have not known. But, well, obviously he knew. They all knew. But they were here. They were around for it. In fact, the head of the Center for Allergy and Infectious Disease, Dr. Fauci, was in charge of that department back then. He got in charge in 1984. So there are still, in fact, the other person that's brought up is at the time the mayor of New York City, is now a slightly senile senator from New York. Yeah, she was then a very, very cranky, very argumentative mayor of San Francisco. Now she's a senile senator. But again, she was around. The mayor of New York City, who the now disgraced guy, yeah, his father was in charge of New York City and doing absolutely nothing. The father was shamed into doing something when one of the AIDS activists wrote a play and essentially shamed the city of New York into doing something. So that's really what this book shows, and it's scary to think that there is so much politics going on when it comes to saving people's lives. So, and again, this was the AIDS epidemic, so it's a slow burn in a sense. It took a while. We now know that the AIDS virus ended up in the U.S. in around the 1960s. That's when it actually popped up. It just takes a while. It has a really, really long incubation period compared to, say, COVID. You have several years. I think when I looked up the Wikipedia, it's like 11 years before it hits full-blown AIDS, and that's without treatment. So it takes some time. And then, of course, they had to figure out what the heck it was, because it was AIDS. You don't die of AIDS. You die of opportunistic infections caused by the AIDS virus essentially destroying your immune system. So basically, people are dying. You die of something else. It's just AIDS allows you to be killed by something else that normally wouldn't kill you. So it was difficult to figure that out. But again, this book really does show the nonsense and the red tape and the politics and the egos that are very much involved in the U.S. medical system. So it's a very, very interesting read. It's also a very hard read, particularly during a pandemic. But it's also really sad. You hear, because Shilts was in the heart of it, and he knew people who died, and then of course he died of it himself. He knew the details of this disease, and he talks about different people dying and how they're dying. And they lose their eyesight, they lose everything, they waste away and are often alone, and it's horrible. And he talks about one thing with the San Francisco hospital, which is the AIDS clinic. They changed their rules because one man, his mother showed up, kicked out his lover, and he never saw his lover again before he died. And they changed their rules so that it's the family you choose who has power, rather than your biological family. Because remember, a lot of these gay people, their families disowned them because they were gay, and their families would have been very, very abusive to them. So this specific AIDS clinic wanted to give power back to these people. But he talks about the horrors of the desperation of people going to Paris for experimental treatments or going to Mexico for anything. They were desperate. They were extremely desperate for anything because a lot of them were young. We're not talking older men. We're talking men who were in their late 20s and their 30s who were dying. Miserable deaths. And Shilts goes into this because, again, he was there. I mean, these were his friends. These were people he knew. These were people he had talked to. These were his sources when things weren't deadly and the world wasn't crazy. At least not in the sense that the gay community was being torn apart by itself and slowly dying. So it really does go into depth on that. The other thing that I'm going to bring up that this shows is this book puts a little bit too much pressure on a disease cluster, where you have that focused, at least at its center, was a French-Canadian airline steward. And this was something that was grabbed on at one point in time. So you had this French-Canadian airline steward who was labeled as patient O, but it was taken as patient 0. So he was considered patient 0 for the longest time. He did die in '83 of AIDS. He was a very sexually active French-Canadian airline steward. and it focuses on him a lot before he dies, and how at one point in time it kind of villainizes him, and the publisher of this book has since said, yeah, we pushed it because it was shock value. So it is not true. He did not. They were basically claiming that he was at fault in some way. He brought it to the United States, which is not true. Again, we know now that he had nothing to do with it. He was highly sexually active, but so were a lot of the gay men at that time. But once he knew he had it, he was still having sex with a lot of other men. Again, so were a bunch of other gay men. So he was not at fault again. But they do push that, but that was the theory at the time. Again, this book was published in 1989. Please keep that into account. And of course, the author had no chance to really update it, and he died in 94. So, fantastic book. Age range, personally, I'm not going to give it to a kid until they're about 16. It's really detailed. It can be very, very gruesome. It's very hard to, until you're a bit older, more mature, to wrap your head around this. And just the insanity of it, and the heartbreak, and the horrors of this. And I think you kind of, just my personal opinion, you need that maturity level, at least 16, if not a little bit older, depending on your kid, to really grasp this. So that's where I'm recommending. It's a fantastic book to read, particularly if you're looking at what's going on in the 1980s, if you're looking at how the government works with the disease, or in this case, doesn't. So that is it for this review. Highly recommend this book. It's and a band played on, which basically Shilts says it means business as usual. So that's what the title means. Fantastic book about the AIDS epidemic. Highly recommend it. This is one of, if you like what you see here, I am covering the film, which is a completely different beast there. I will get to that. But I also cover a bunch of other stuff. This is one of my more serious stuff. A lot of times I cover children's picture books. So, and a bunch of other stuff. And I think that's my fussing toddler. So I'm going to end this video. If you like it, you see, like and subscribe. Thank you.